Hello, I'm Caitlin Dillon. I love language, so I became a linguist, and I love people, so I became a teacher. I believe that knowing more about language helps teachers be more effective decision makers and instructors of their students, and just enjoy teaching more. So in this presentation, I'd like to give you enough understanding of the framework I use for talking and thinking about all that's involved in learning language and becoming literate, so that we can use that framework in future discussions regarding teaching language and literacy related skills. Let's start with this scene. In it, Rembrandt shows us Jesus' mother Mary when she is expecting him. She has just arrived to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is also expecting her own son, John the Baptist. When Mary greets Elizabeth, Elizabeth says to her, "As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy." I was reminded of this scene when thinking about some fascinating research, which has shown that, as humans, we begin acquiring language even before we are born. Researchers have shown that we are perceiving language even while in our mother's wombs before birth. Infants experience listening before they are born allows them to be able to distinguish their mother's voice from other voices very soon after birth, and to distinguish the language they've been hearing from other languages. That early experience continues on through life, allowing us to develop the skills often included by educators when discussing the acquisition of language and literacy. Those skills include listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Some folks also add in the skill of viewing, or visualizing and visually representing. I'd like to discuss these skills and some others with a particular focus on how they are related to each other and the implications of their relationships for us as teachers. In order to do that, I'm going to address three main questions very briefly. Each question is studied by whole fields of researchers and educators, so the answers could all be much more in-depth. But this brief overview will still be helpful for our purposes. The three questions are: first, how do we learn about the world? In other words, how do we acquire information about the world? Second, how do we learn about language? In other words, how do we acquire information about language? And third, how do we learn language? In other words, how do we acquire language itself? For questions 2 and 3, we will discuss how we learn both about spoken language, as in learning the sounds and sound patterns of the language, and how we learn spoken language itself, speaking and listening. And we will discuss how we learn about written language, the symbols and patterns of symbols used in writing, and how we learn written language itself, recognizing written words, and being able to produce them correctly. Before addressing those questions, I'm going to show you the final conclusion. This schema or model or diagram is the picture I will build throughout this presentation. It includes skills involved in the acquisition of language and literacy and shows the relationships among those skills. Study it for a moment and notice that it includes the aspects of language and literacy I just mentioned: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. I will be talking about how viewing fits in a moment. Please keep in mind that this is the big picture I'll be leading up to by focusing on various parts of it throughout the presentation. The top components and connections are related to meaning. The connections between the components represent listening comprehension and speaking, or composing one's thoughts using language. And comprehension and composition can together be referred to as comp skills. Those parts of the acquisition of language and literacy that have to do with meaning and the relationship between spoken language and ideas or pictures are the comp aspects. The bottom components and connections have to do with getting the words off the page, or decoding, and getting the words onto the page, or encoding. These two processes both involve the code, the ways that written symbols are used to represent spoken languages. So together, they can be referred to as code skills. This is a lot. It's amazing what we do as humans in terms of acquiring language and literacy. So let's address certain parts a little more specifically now,